So I titled my sermon, Contentment Defined, and Paul's going to unpack all this. I have an opening illustration. It was spring, but summer is what I wanted, those warm days. It was summer, but it was fall that I wanted, the colorful leaves. It was fall, but it was winter I wanted, the beautiful snow in the holiday season. It's now winter, but it was spring that I wanted, the warm weather and the blossoming of nature. I was a child, you guys will remember this, but I wanted to be an adult. I wanted that freedom. I was 20, but I wanted to be 30. I wanted to be mature. I was middle-aged, but I wanted to be 20. You know, to have my brains and go back to be 20. I'd be a genius, you know. I was retired, but I was middle-aged that I wanted, the presence of mind. My life is over, and I never got what I wanted. And it seems like we spend most of our life kind of doing that. What do you think you need in order to be content? Like searching for this contentment. Do you need more stuff? I mean, we live in the land of stuff. People have storage units of stuff that they have to pay rent on because they don't have the room for it in their house. Do you need a house that's on the HGTV? Like it's the perfect look, the perfect setup for you? Do you need that special car? What is it that makes you content? The rich are tempted to deny God. The poor are tempted to want to be like the rich. Both could steal in order to gain. The writer of Proverbs, I paraphrased Proverbs 37 through 9, he says, "Give me a content life." He's talking to God. "Give me what I need. Help me see you are the most important thing, Lord." Today, Paul is going to teach us this hard, sobering jewel of Christianity, the idea of contentment and where it actually comes from. It's the simple answer. You guys will say, I know it's found in Christ. I know it's saying that I need Him. But as I found, as I go through my life, it seems to be I have to daily kind of reset, daily refocus, daily kind of redirect my life on God. And so Paul begins this section by saying, "I rejoiced in the Lord greatly that now at length you have revived your concern for me." So Paul is writing this letter to the Christians in Philippi, and he's ending the letter, but he's also going to tell you today why he wrote the letter in the first place. And oftentimes in the Bible, when you read something, you can figure out who the author was and what he was writing for if you just kind of read through the whole letter. He said, "You were indeed concerned for me." Because Paul's in prison and these Philippian Christians know that, "but you had no opportunity to help me," he said. "Not that I am speaking of being in need, for I have learned in whatever situation I am to be content. I know how to be brought low, and I know how to abound. In any and every circumstance, I have learned the secret of facing plenty and hunger, abundance and need. I can do all things through Him who strengthens me." Paul ends his letter the way he begins it, with this rejoicing spirit. You see here a model of giving and receiving. Scholars say it's like a triangle between Paul, God, and the Philippian church, and how he approaches this idea of giving and where our thankfulness and joy is to be found. He talks about the idea of money today in a very nice and appropriate way, which then leads me into the opportunity to get to talk about giving and money. And he's rejoicing because these Christians sent him resources. And in the idea of rejoicing greatly, we said last week, if a person walked around and they had a constant, ongoing, always joyful personality, and then Jimmy hollered out, you might think they're a little different. It's true though, right? We live in a culture where like a person can't be like joyful all the time, right? But yet the Scriptures say we should rejoice always. We should rejoice in the Lord greatly now that at length. So Paul is basically saying that he is rejoicing in God for these Christians who have resourced him and encouraged him. And I think that we need to remind ourselves that we need to be walking around greatly rejoicing for the Jesus we have in our lives, the body of believers, because Paul is rejoicing for these other Christians who are encouraging him. And so we have this church body that's encouraging us. But most importantly, we have this gospel message that means that we have the greatest problem in our life taken care of if we place trust in Jesus. Here's some application for you. He looks to exalt Jesus as his source and ultimate strength. And he's finding and pulling everything from that. And that's what I love about Paul, is he's laser beam focused on the gospel. And when it's easy for us to get sidetracked on all the other things that are going on. I was just reading an article this morning, and something that we can all agree with is when they do the inauguration for the president, they put their hand on what? A Bible. Every president does, from what I understand. And so you get to see that and you say, whether we think they all follow it or believe it, this country still has the leader put his hand on a Bible and swear an oath. And you go, that should give you hope. That like, even though it looks messy sometimes, like we still live in a free country where the leadership is going to say, hey, I acknowledge this book. And I believe that God is the author of this book. And hopefully they're pulling guidance and wisdom and direction from that book. In Paul's culture, there was this incorrect teaching that contentment was found within self. We're not much different than the culture in Paul's time, are we? Contentment is found within yourself, is what was being taught. Well, what Paul is teaching is this transformative idea that contentment is only found in believing in Jesus Christ. So Paul is telling the Christians to live counter to this kind of self-help culture. And I want you to miss this. Contentment was rare in Paul's day. It appears it's very rare today as well. And when you start picking apart your life, or we'll say, I like to take an inventory and analyzing different aspects of your life, you'll see how many little idols you've created, or things that they're just not pointing you towards the cross. And then I have to admit that I'm just a man. Because we have an ongoing saga at our house about the TV and the distraction of the TV, and I've done TV fast. I got rid of the TV for 6 months of my life, and we regularly have these fasts, but in my weakness and need for relaxation, I also just say, you know what, I like watching that TV. And then I say, let's watch some color TV, and that reminds me of my Uncle Roger. I said, we'll sit down and watch color TV today. Everybody's got a color TV, but to my Uncle Roger, he had a new color TV that they didn't used to have, I guess, at some point, but he talked about watching color TV when I was a kid. And so I like watching color TV. Not all the time, but sometimes. And I'm just a man, but I like watching The Rookie. It's a good show. It's about cops and stuff and that kind of thing. And like, you know, my wife will be like, we watch too much TV. And I'll say, I know, but I like watching it right now. And so I'm just a person. I'm not perfect. I don't have this all figured out. Because the Bible answer would be, all of my contentment, everything's found in Jesus. I should be reading my Bible 24/7. It's kind of like what you think it should be like, but like we're all broken people. Even though we're saved, we're still on this journey. That's the sanctification process. But you guys can all agree that contentment is surely rare in our day and era like it was then. But Paul says that I have learned, he uses that word, I have learned twice. He says, not that I'm speaking of being in need, for I have learned. So Paul's saying he doesn't have it all figured out. This is what I like about Paul. Because Paul says a lot of things that like some people will make you feel like you shouldn't be feeling if you're a Christian. Like Paul will say, I'm going to try to worry less about you guys. In other letters that he's written, which means what? If he's going to try to worry less. He's worrying a little bit about these people. He loves them. He has some concern for them. He admits that he had to learn in whatever situation I am to be content. I know how to be brought low. I know how to abound. And in every circumstance, I have learned the secret. So he uses this word, I have learned. He says this twice. So for me, it's encouraging to say Paul just wasn't zapped. His heart didn't just change. And he wasn't just like this perfectly content Christian from the moment that he started to follow Christ, which should give me and you hope as we're on this journey of saying I'm not as content as I want to be, but I'm more content than I used to be. And I think that's a good place to find yourself. He knew abundance and he knew wealth. he was no more content in the abundance and wealth in his experiences. I want you to get this. Many believe it's harder to be content when you have plenty and you have no need at all. But Paul also knew great hardship. Listen to what Paul said in a couple different examples. Up to the present hour, we are both hungry and thirsty. This is 1 Corinthians 4. We were poorly clothed, roughly treated, homeless. We labor, working with our own hands. He goes on in 2 Corinthians, by great endurance, by afflictions, by hardship, by difficulties, by beatings, by imprisonment, by riots, by labor, by sleepless nights, by times of hunger. So Paul describes to you great trial, in fact, greater trial than I think most of us have ever personally experienced. Listen to this third reading. 3 times I was shipwrecked. I'm done after the first one. I'm not going to pull Titanic a couple different times, you know what I'm saying? He said, I spent a night and a day in the open sea. I don't think I want to do that one time. On frequent journeys, he faced sleepless nights, hunger, thirst, no food, cold, lack of clothing. So when we hear Paul say he's content, it's not like that he had this glamorous, wealthy, jet-set lifestyle where everything was easy and cush for him. He experienced abundance. But he also went through great trial and difficulty and riots and beatings and almost dying on the open sea and shipwreck and hunger. You read all these things, the challenges that he faced. So when he tells you he's experienced both sides, but I've found contentment in the one who brings me strength. That should give us hope to know that Paul has walked the journey that we walk. So when we read about Paul, we can go, I can relate to the brother. He brings me comfort in his story. Because Paul really knew what it meant to be brought low. Like, have you guys ever been beaten? Have you been in a riot? Have you slept out in like frigid temperatures? Have you been treated roughly perhaps? Have you been homeless? Have you had this just difficulty and trial in your life? And so like Paul knows what it's meant and what it feels like to be brought low. And so what he is saying to his readers today, his readers, and what he's saying to us is he learned contentment was found in a relationship with Jesus. And so for us, that means we have to be seeking after Jesus, but it also means that Paul learned what mattered. He didn't always know what mattered, because if you guys read Paul's whole story, he was this Christian hunter before he became a Christian, and he was always seeking approval from the religious leaders to arrest Christians because he was against them. So Paul wasn't always this like on fire Christian. So he went from being a Christian hunter to radically being saved and then finding all of his hope in Jesus and all these stories that he's telling you about. So Paul learned what mattered in life. And I think we have to learn as we take steps forward. So when you have this declaration of faith in your life, that's a beautiful thing, right? But then there's this journey you go on. And I think that it progressively can become a little more challenging, as Jesus said in Luke, to die to yourself, to lay aside yourself, your will, your way, to like come in alignment with Jesus and serve and do and be how God would want you to be. As a husband, you're sacrificially serving your wife and children. Those aren't pretty words. They're not the kind of words that our culture likes to be said out loud, right? Because it means it's difficult. We're to be leaders and sacrificially serving in our workplaces. We're to be sacrificially serving in our neighborhoods and in our society. And Jesus said those who were what? He said those who will be first here on earth. What is it? First will be last, right? And so you see what I'm saying? It's the opposite. It's the paradox principle of living here on earth. And I don't want you to miss this. It involves a regular struggle to believe that Christ is enough. Because what we're getting ready to get in is a little talk about financial giving that Paul talks about. And I think that we all lack trust. We all lack that God is enough and that God will provide for us. If you get nothing else today, this is what I want you to get. There are 2 schools. There's one of prosperity and there's one of poverty. And both of them offer us many tests in our journey, like in life. But I think the greatest test that poverty and prosperity offer us is the test of greed. Listen to, these are some scriptures I read earlier. The one who loves money is never satisfied with money. And whoever loves wealth is never satisfied with income. For the love of money is rooted in all kinds of evil, and by craving it, some have wandered away from the faith and pierced themselves with many pains. Instruct those who are rich in the present age not to be arrogant or to set their hope on the uncertainty of wealth, but on God, who richly provides us with all of the things that we need. So the poor can be tested with greed as well as the rich. Greed causes the poor to be tempted. But I've seen wealthy people, I've worked with wealthy people who were liars, cheaters, and stealers, and they were just as greedy as anybody else. And so we all have these temptations that we're faced with, right? Here's a main point. Greed isn't removed when one becomes rich or poor. If so, then all of the rich people in the news or Hollywood, they would be happy, rejoiceful people, right? They've accomplished and have everything. And what do we see, though? We see the opposite of that, actually, right? They die from drug addictions. They appear to live really terrible lives in many circumstances. And I'm not here to say that wealth is a bad thing, because I think handled correctly, it's not a bad thing. But what Paul is really getting at is it's a heart issue. It's a heart issue, and Paul makes clear that contentment flows through a union with Christ. You're never going to be content when you make money, because they actually say there's some scientific data that says the threshold of satisfaction is $75,000 in America. And if you make $75,000, that is the happiest you're going to become. So the more you make than 75, the statistics say you won't become more happier. So the lead up to 75, they said your life will become a little easier and you'll become a little happier, but at 75,000, which isn't that much money, they say, statistics and some scientists say that is the threshold for happiness. And so the more you make doesn't mean you're going to become a happier person. So we must find our satisfaction in something else besides what the world tells us to pursue. There's this secret. He uses this word, the secret. And Paul says there's a secret that he's found. And what it is Christ empowers us. Christ brings peace. Christ brings satisfaction. Paul is able to share this secret because he learned to give attention to the Savior. He isn't preoccupied with his situation. Remember, Paul's in jail. He's under house arrest. And so he should be griping and complaining, right, that he's in jail. But he's not preoccupied with his situation, which is, I think, a good illustration for many of us today, because we become preoccupied with things that have nothing to do with the gospel. We become preoccupied with our government. We become preoccupied with our jobs. We become preoccupied with family disputes and medical issues and all these things that we become preoccupied with, right? When the point of everything is Jesus. And if we live and focus like Paul and we aren't preoccupied with our situations and we're preoccupied with Christ, then we have this great application that the gospel brings joy, peace, and happiness, which means you can be joyful and rejoice always in every circumstance, because Christ is your point. As Paul said in, I think it was earlier in Philippians, whether I'm here or whether I'm home with Jesus, like it's a gain to be home with Jesus, but I'm going to stay here with you guys for the time being, right? And so we need to focus on Christ. He goes on and says, yet it was kind of you to share my trouble. And you Philippians yourself know that in the beginning of the gospel, when I left Macedonia, no church entered into partnership with me in giving and receiving except you only. Even in Thessalonica, you sent me help for my needs once and again. So Paul shows us here there's this inseparable relationship between financial giving and gospel partnership. If you aren't giving, Paul is saying here, you're not a partner. You're more like a consumer. And apparently what he's getting at is there were some who were receiving benefits of Paul's ministry, his teaching, his care, but they weren't helping in advancing the word or moving the gospel. He views the Philippians as co-laborers because they put skin in the game. And so what Paul is getting at is we've got to put skin in the game. So here's some application. How common is this? Like, what kind of an issue is this in the church today? Receiving benefit, but not assuming any responsibility. When a person is receiving sound instruction, which leads to a life of godliness, receiving pastoral care, Paul is basically saying it becomes a privilege to support the mission of the church. And you're helping move this thing forward. You're seeing the benefit of it in your own life, in your family, recognizing that there is no money tree out back. So Paul is saying it takes resources to move the word. Don't miss this. He says join as partners. And so partnership involves more than money, but what Paul is saying is it's critical because what he's demonstrating is you cannot carry out a mission on pure sympathy by itself. So it takes resources to move this thing downfield. But listen, he goes on and says, not that I seek the gift. So he's basically saying, I'm not writing you because I want your money, but I seek the fruit that increases to your credit. So Paul's taking it back spiritual, and he wants them to know that his joy isn't because they've given him financial gifts. He's not pressing the importance because he wants to get rich. He just told you that he's experienced all these hardships in other letters. He's pressing the importance because he wants to see the fruit that you're due in your life from spiritually, sacrificially giving. He wants them to bear fruit. He wants them to profit spiritually. And I can tell you guys, you profit very, very much as a giver in the kingdom of God. So I have some application for you. Do you have a disciplined plan for giving to the mission of the church? And I'm not specifically saying giving money to this church. Do you have a plan, a disciplined plan that makes sense on how you support the move of God in and around your community in life? And I thought I would give an illustration from my own life. So when I got my life right with the Lord, one of the first things I wanted to do was I wanted to financially give. I don't know why, but I did. And so we did that for a good portion of our marriage. And then as I grew into my career and money became an idol and I was really consumed by money and possessions, guess what happened? I gave less. And then guess what happened? 2007, my wife left me. As I'm at the peak of my career financially, I'm like the lowest I've ever been in my personal life, right? And so as we got our, we'll say we fully committed, rededicated our lives to Christ in 2007, we said we don't ever want to fall off this ship ever again. And so we basically committed ourselves to being tithers and givers above and beyond the tithe to help support missions and people that we meet along the journey. And I'm telling you, there was times where my tithe check was significant. I mean, I had a six-figure job. I made a lot of money. And you just do 10% of that, right? And I'm just being honest with you guys. I've never heard that the pastor shouldn't tell you these kinds of things. So I'm just wanting to be honest with you because I know a lot of people will go, does the pastor even tithe? Fair question. If you'd like to see my bank statement, I'd be happy to show it to you. You look at my salary that's on the public budget. You take 10% out of that, and that's what my tithe is. So you can figure that real easily. It's a public budget. And then I love getting opportunities to give above and beyond as I meet people, as missionaries come into my life, as I find people in the community that have need. I've done all kinds of things for people that were personal, that had nothing to do with the church. And I've stepped up in those ways to give above and beyond. One of my first pastor who really loved me, his name was Jerry Parks. He taught me the principle of, he said, you should give. You may not be able to defend this biblically, but he said, I like to say you should give 10% to the church, and then you should give above and beyond that to missions and offerings and people you meet along the journey. And I've just kind of accepted that as my personal philosophy, and I have opportunities that come my way all the time to help people. And it can be as simple as, hey, I didn't charge him for gas in my car when I went and picked him up. I just took that. That's a tithe. It just costs money, right? Or you took them lunch, or all the different things we do for people that you consider, all these things cost resources in my personal life, right? You guys see what I'm getting at? I'm wanting to be transparent with you to say, I practice what I preach. And I'm telling you guys that if you haven't, you should work out a disciplined plan that begins somewhere, because I get paid on the first, and one of the first thing I do is I tithe. I go on to the church website, logosdecatur.org, and I log into the planning center and I give. I don't like to set up an automatic gift because I just like to give. I like to control how I pay my bills and things like that. And so I don't set a lot of things up on auto, and I'm just giving you a real life story of what this thing actually looks like in my own life. And Paul goes on and says, I have received full payment and more. I am well supplied, having received from Epaphroditus. So this is where Paul's telling you how he wrote this letter. So the church in Philippi sent Epaphroditus to meet Paul in this imprisonment. He was in house arrest, and Epaphroditus took Paul resources. So you guys have read the whole letter now. The last 12 weeks or so, we went through the whole book of Philippians, and now you're getting to how the letter got to Paul. They gave Epaphroditus money and resources to take to Paul, and Epaphroditus took these resources. In this letter of what we call Philippians is Paul's writing back to thank them. So Epaphroditus, the gift you sent, a fragrant offering, a sacrifice acceptable and pleasing to God, and my God will supply every need of yours according to His riches in glory in Christ Jesus. To our God and Father be glory forever and ever. So Paul goes Old Testament on us and says that these Old Testament sacrifices made a pleasing aroma skyward towards God. And what Paul is saying is your sacrificial giving of your resources, he's telling the Philippians and he's telling us today, it pleases God. And that you should do it. He's actually saying giving is worship to God. It's a form of worship. I don't want you to miss this. What is a pleasing smell to you? If we were to say, what is something that arouses your senses and goes, oh, that's a nice smell, like you light a candle that smells like apple pie, or Thanksgiving, or the Christmas tree smells, all those different things, they bring in these scents, right? Paul makes clear sacrificial obedience is pleasing to God. We get to give. I've been a missionary, so before I was a pastor, I was a missionary for 10 years. No kidding, I lived off of people's checks. Like, how did that work? Like, well, I went out and asked people for resources, and they either gave or they didn't give. And the first year I did missionary work, basically it was like, hope the checks come in. We lived like that. I ended up living like that for 10 years. It grew my faith exponentially and trusting, because what happened was I thought that we would be doing it for a year and that the resources would run out, everybody would stop giving. Year after year, what happened? It actually increased. Year after year. Increased. Because we had more kids. And it kept increasing. And like every time we had a need, we did panic. And like have stress and anxiety and worry. But we did pray a little bit too. And what God did is every year He met our needs. Every year. Even when I planted this church. Crazy story. When we planted this church, we didn't have any money. But my other ministry did. So the other ministry I was a part of, I was never the leader of it. They said, we're going to pay you for 8 months to plant your church, but you don't work for us anymore. You're going to just do the church thing. That wasn't my plan. Yeah, I didn't have a plan. I didn't know what I was going to get a job. In fact, I remember some of the people aren't here anymore. I was going to find a job somewhere and do this too. And then all of a sudden, iron sharpens iron, said, no, we're going to pay you for 8 months, just like you work for us, but you don't work for us. Plant the church. God bless you. Do you need a computer too? Yes, we'll give you that. Do you need that camera? Yeah, we'll give you that camera. Whatever you need to be successful, we want to do that for you. God met all of our needs. And then 8 months into the church plant, when that was ending, all of a sudden the church was in the right position to pay me a salary. God met all the needs. It worked out time and time and time again. And Paul is saying that we get to give. We give as a response to this marvelous grace that God has shown us. We give because Jesus is the ultimate giver. He gave His life right for us. Here's some application for you. Every week when we give, this is what we should say. This is only by your grace, Lord. Receive this as a joyful offering of worship to the one who made me His own. And we should be thankful that we get to give. Here's my conclusion for you. Paul doesn't promise that God's going to provide for all of our greed. He does say that God will provide all of our needs. He will provide everything we need to live for Christ. And I found He meets us all along the way. I just went to Peru, another country. Someone else paid for the whole thing. God met all the needs, because I said, well, how am I going to get to Peru? And then all of a sudden it all worked out the way that God wanted it to work out. And I found that as we place trust in God, He meets us all along the way. Those giving and living like the Philippians should trust in God's provision. Paul is a living testimony that God will provide for all of your needs. Through abundance and need, he found that Christ is enough. We can trust our Father. You got to reject the fear. You got to take hold of this fear that controls you and scares you and makes you feel like things aren't going to work out, that you have to be in control. That's what it is. We have to be in control. And when we trust God and reject our fear and let go, we realize that He is a good, good Father. And even simple things like I get to substitute teach to make extra money for my family. I find joy in being a substitute PE teacher for kindergartners. Someone just asked me the other day about Sonic 3. I said, I haven't seen it, but I heard all about it from kindergartners who were doing sprints and telling me that they were running like Sonic. And I said, it's a great feeling to have as I get these opportunities to serve in our community and make a little extra money at the same time. We must fix our eyes on the cross. We must take any of our doubts and anxiety that Paul has already been talking about, and we must press on and we must strain forward, remembering that God has already solved. This is the third time I've said this, and there's been a point where I've said it 3 times. God has already solved you and mine's greatest problem. We were separated from God because of our sin. You're born depraved. And you don't have to spend too much time with kids to go, they're just ornery. We'll call that ornery, but it's sin at the same time, right? We're born broken. And Jesus made a way for us. God gave His own Son. And if God can solve the biggest problem in our lives, don't you think He can provide you with your daily bread?